Yeah, as I said, a lot of this is freshman bio review, and not even freshman bio, like 7th grade bio review. Like, this is literally the slide I use for 7th grade bio. Biotic, abiotic. Bio means living. My favorite story with this is when I interviewed to come up here to work, I interviewed at a high school biology job, and my certification is in life science. And I interviewed to teach biology, and I'm in an interview with the assistant principal at a high school, and she all of a sudden stops. She goes, "Oh my gosh, I'm looking here at your resume, and it says you're certified in life sciences. We actually need somebody who's certified in biology. So I'm sorry to waste your time. I'm going to have to cut this interview short because you're not certified to teach this class." And I was like, I was trying not to be disrespectful. I was like, I mean, biology, bio is life. Like life science, like that is literally, that's just like a synonym for and she was not having it. Like I literally did not get a job because like the person interviewing me didn't understand what bio meant. And quite frankly, I don't know if I really want to work with somebody who didn't even prepare for like a basic interview with their. Oh, and the other ironic thing with it was like they're like, FCPS has very high standards for their teachers, and that's why we have to have a teacher who's certified. I'm like anyways, I'll move on. But obviously that's kind of funny. But yeah, bio means life. And it's living, and this is kind of like a thing people forget about, once living thing. So like you have a dead leaf. Technically a dead leaf is a biotic factor, something that would be considered biotic. And then abiotic, the letter A means not, so it's the opposite of. So abiotic things, the non-living things. And these things have a very big determinant on like which types of organisms live in different places. The adaptations you'll see with species in different environments. So, compare like the desert versus the rainforest, like the adaptations of organisms that live in the desert versus like the rainforest. So abiotic things are super, super important to determining species. Cursor over here. Just kind of reminding you of like the levels of organization in life. Assuming we're not talking about like starting from the atom, and assuming we assume the cell. The smallest kind of thing here, when you're thinking like from an ecology point of view, is the organism. And then if you get a bunch of organisms that are the same species, that's called a population, which we talked about last class. And then a community, that's when you have all the different species or all the different populations within a given area. So given area can be a little subjective, and so that can just depend on usually it's based upon the researcher. The researcher is going to choose, hey, what is going to be our given area that we're going to study? And then if you include, and so key thing with community is it's just biotic things. When you consider the ecosystem, so people who say the ecosystem, they're usually doing a lot of measurements, and measurements are coming from studying a lot of the non-living, the abiotic factors, like maybe rainfall or like the climate and stuff like that. And then the biosphere is when you consider all of the ecosystems or all the biomes as well. There's technically biomes that's in between biosphere and ecosystem, but anyways, that would be your biosphere. Okay. Some clicker issues here. Yeah, all right. So again, ecosystem, all the living and non-living things in a given area. So size of an ecosystem, there isn't necessarily one exact size. It just kind of depends on, again, what you're choosing to study. Oh, yeah.
You can't access the slides.
Oh, slides. Okay. Let me change. Thank you for letting me know. Oh, we have smoothies coming around for teacher appreciation. Maybe I can change the settings. I swear these settings just like change on their own, like randomly.
You like a smoothie?
I would love a smoothie.
Okay. You want pineapple? Or mango?
Yeah,
Is it interesting?
Pineapple.
Yeah.
Pineapple. There you go.
Yeah, I think it's got to be for
Yeah.
This is a gigantic truck. What's that say? Anyway. Huh? What's up? Yes, I have it. Anyways, okay. Yeah, there can be aquatic ecosystems or terrestrial. Aquatic is kind of obvious. That's in the ocean. Terrestrial actually is referring to land. So any of your different land biomes. And this is key, especially coming off of us talking about evolution. Ecosystems change over time, which is to say that they evolve. So what would be an adaptation to survive in, Virginia now? Maybe those adaptations wouldn't allow organisms to survive in Virginia 500 or 1,000 years ago. Okay. And then within an ecosystem, there's something called the habitat. So that'd be like the different kind of place that an organism lives. So within an ecosystem, you could have like a stream ecosystem within like a broader, like kind of, temperate deciduous forest kind of ecosystem. Okay. All right. So then, getting into like, all right, well, what determines like the size of a population, and then again, some of the different like biodiversity and the different species living there is going to be things called limiting factors, and limiting factors can be biotic or abiotic. So this is just focusing on biotic limiting factors. So that could be like the food that's available. So really thinking about how much food. Or you could think of like when we talk about the finches, the different kinds of food that'll determine, like the slightly like the different kind of variations of like beak size, or like giraffe neck length, disease. So if there's a disease that like maybe like there's like a fungus that breaks out among like a population of plants, if you can get a species of plant that's resistant to that fungus, that species of plant is going to be way more likely to survive and reproduce. So they're going to eventually take over that ecosystem. Competition, right? So if there's competition for food, there's limited resources, then that's something that, evolution, one of the big things evolution needs is limited resources, so competition, so that you have adaptations that allow something to survive and reproduce. Predators, so somewhat related to competition, but slightly different, thinking of, caterpillars and birds eating the caterpillars. If you're a caterpillar, that can help, you have a just slightly different coloration that allows you to blend in better to your environment. You're more likely to survive and reproduce. All right, and then some of your abiotic limiting factors, so the amount of water, especially like fresh water in the area. So think of the desert, right? So if you're an organism that lives in a desert ecosystem and you don't have adaptations that's going to allow you to conserve water, you're not going to survive very long. So that's why you don't see, species that live in the desert that can't conserve water, because they've all died off. Climate, right? Like if you can't handle really cold or really hot temperatures, think of like polar bears or a lot of things living in like the tundra. They have a lot of blubber, things that kind of help insulate themselves from the cold, but that adaptation would not be helpful in the desert, right? Amount of light. If you were to compare maybe like plants that live at the very bottom of the tropical rainforest versus in the canopy, plants that live in the bottom of the tropical rainforest are going to be much better at kind of angling themselves, contorting their bodies to be able to get access to the little bits of light that can make it through the upper canopy. And then amount of living space. That's going to limit, kind of the overall population. So a lot of common sense stuff, especially for you as seniors and for a lot of people who have taken apes, but worth pointing out so you kind of get those free points. Now we're talking about inter-specific competition. So think of an interstate, it goes between states. So inter-specific interactions, it's really referring to like how different species interact with each other. So there can be, and usually how you see this is with like positive, negative, or neutral, some combination of those. So if there is a negative and a negative where both things lose, that is competition, right? If you're an organism, you would like to not have competition, obviously. Evolution, like in terms of like promoting different adaptations, evolution, natural selection favors competition, but if you're in any one species, you don't want competition. Predation, that's going to be where one thing benefits, the other is harmed. Herbivory, that's somewhat related to predation, where something's getting eaten. Anyways, I'm gonna go over these one at a time. I don't want to kind of waste it there. What causes interspecific competition, or any competition, is a short supply of resources. Okay, so if there's not a shortage of resources, there is no competition. Okay. Then there's something called competitive exclusion principle. So in ecology, there's something called a niche. So a niche is like within a specific ecosystem, there's a certain kind of role that that organism would play. So maybe like there could be the niche of like organisms that like feast on like a certain kind of food, or they like inhabit, you know, the upper part of a tree if it's like a certain species of bird. You know, it's very difficult for two species that have the exact same niche or exact same role in ecosystem to exist together. Typically what happens is the one that has a slight reproductive advantage, which is to say that the organism that has a slightly better adaptation to that environment, that can better outcompete the other one, that one is eventually going to eliminate the other. Because what happens is, thinking of like Hardy-Weinberg and allele frequencies, if you have a certain allele and that lets you survive this much better than the other one, you're going to have this many more organisms in the other one. Then over time, you know, because you're starting here, that gap just keeps growing and growing and growing until the species that's not as adapted is going to eventually just die off. Okay. Now there can be something called resource partitioning, where if there are two organisms that share the same niche, you know, if there are similar species that kind of, you know, they normally would like clash with each other, there can be like slight differences in how those resources are partitioned. Maybe like there's some sort of like stream that slightly like isolates one niche from another. That's how you can get two very similar species that can coexist. Okay, so a little bit more on niches. We refer to ecological niche. That's referring to the sum total. So like consider all things considered part of an organism's use of their abiotic and biotic resources in the environment. So it's kind of the overall view of the organism's role in the environment. How do they use the abiotic resources like water, or biotic resources? So how do they get their food? Within ecological niche, there's the fundamental niche and the realized niche. And they can seem a little confusing, but I think if you focus on fundamental and realized, it actually says what the difference is. Realized is like realistically, what is their niche? So if we're looking at two species of barnacle, the realized niche of Chthalamus? I don't know how we say that, but anyways, this is the realistically, this is where it lives at. It lives at kind of in the high tide zone because you have the Balanus barnacle that has its own realized niche that extends down into low tide. Now the fundamental niche is like the theoretical, like, you know, not all things considered, where could theoretically the Chthalamus barnacle live at? And theoretically, it could also occupy the low tide zone. So maybe some freak thing happens that knocks out the Balanus barnacle. Then, yeah, the Chthalamus barnacle could then take over that. Why that's important is because if you're an ecologist studying an ecosystem, trying to figure out, well, you know, just because the Chthalamus barnacle lives here, it's important to try to think about, well, how far could it potentially expand itself if we were to like do some project that might remove a certain species of barnacle. So you can kind of, so it doesn't, you know, perhaps turn into like its population numbers get too large. Okay, getting into predation. As a predation, it's pretty clearly positive and negative. Within predation, there are some adaptations organisms can have that prevents them from being preyed upon by their predator. So there's something called cryptic coloration. So cryptic, you think of like spycraft type stuff, or if like somebody said something, you're like, that is very cryptic what they're saying. It's like, it's very unclear. So cryptic coloration would be like this owl right here that, you know, maybe you didn't even see that, but it blends in with the tree that it's occupying. Okay. And then there's another difficult sounding word here, aposematic, aposermatic, or warning coloration. But basically it's things that are poisonous, they tend to have really bright colors. And that's kind of something that intuitively for humans and a lot of other species makes sense to us. Like if you're in nature and you see like a really, really brightly colored spider, I know we like shy away from spiders like in general, but like, I don't know about you, but if I see a really brightly colored spider, I naturally avoid that. Like I remember seeing like a really brightly colored spider before I even knew that bright colored meant it was poisonous. and it inherently freaked me out more. I was more inherently afraid of it than one that's like all black. And then there's something called Batesian mimicry. So this is kind of interesting. So this would be the example. So a coral snake is more or less harmless as far as snakes go. A king snake, as King would suggest, is very deadly. You don't want to mess with a king snake, but coral snake, you're not too afraid. But if you look at these, they seem very similarly colored, especially like, you know, if you're having to react really quickly as like an organism that encounters one of those, you very easily might mistake the king snake for the coral snake for a king snake. So the idea here is the coral snake is mimicking the king snake. Okay, it is basically getting it. It's getting its. If the coral snake was by itself, it would die off because it doesn't have like poisonous or really very many defense mechanisms. But it's basically kind of riding the coattails of the king snake. Okay. Now, still kind of within predation, there's another kind of mimicry that sounds fairly similar to Batesian, called Mullerian mimicry. But the difference between Mullerian mimicry is that both species are toxic. I'm going to say that again because even when I was looking over this yesterday, it wasn't clear to me. Mullerian, both are toxic. Okay? Batesian, just one of them. The coral snake is not toxic, wouldn't be very successful on its own. Batesian, whether you're the monarch or the viceroy, both of them would be able to survive fairly well on their own because they're both toxic. But here, two bad-tasting species resemble each other, so both are to be avoided. Now, this is interesting, and I have a question for you. Why would that be beneficial? Like, if like it's I think it's very obvious why it's beneficial for the coral snake to mimic the king snake, but I don't think it's like as obvious for the monarch to mimic the viceroy and vice versa. What do they get out of mimicking each other when they both are equally strong on their own? What did you?
If they have like separate predators, predators would avoid both of them.
Right, exactly. Predators are going to avoid both of them. Okay. So even if it's the same predator, but yeah, especially if it's different or there's multiple predators, it's like the word gets out easier, right? If like the viceroy looks like the monarch, so let's say a predator, viceroy's toxic, it's going to completely avoid it, not only the viceroy, but anything that looks like the viceroy. So basically, it's kind of like doubling the resources of things that get the word out that thing is toxic. Okay. Herbivory is a very complicated word for something that sounding word for something that's actually fairly intuitive. This is like why roses have their thorns and stuff. It's just that plants don't want to be eaten, so plants have different mechanisms to try to prevent organisms from eating them. So that's the kind of the idea of like the thorns on roses, or even like something as like severe. Some plants have like actual chemical toxins on different parts of them that make predators avoid eating them. So there you go. All right, symbiosis. This is kind of a, lighthearted kind of review kind of slide. Now, it's important to, I think some people I could see kind of mushing together symbiosis with like perhaps mutualism. Symbiosis is like the umbrella term, where within symbiosis is mutualism, commensalism, parasitism. Symbiosis is just, again, a catch-all term for just talking about the relationship between organisms, and this is also key, different species. Technically, if it's two, like you're within a species, it's not symbiosis. It's got to be two different species. So if it's mutualism, both are going to benefit. So here, the sea anemone, it's going to benefit from the clownfish cleaning it, and the clownfish benefits from getting to live within the sea anemone. Anemone, right? Commensalism, one benefits, the other just doesn't really care. So the example here is a whale and a barnacle. The barnacle gets the benefit because it gets, basically like a living space on the whale. Also could get a benefit from like eating some stuff on the whale, maybe some scraps from the whale. And the whale is more or less unaffected. Now, if you Google this example, you will see some people say like technically that should be mutualism because the idea is the barnacle might help to eat some parasites that might normally get at the whale, so that's how the whale could benefit. Not super important, just make sure you understand commensalism. One benefits, one is unaffected. And then there's parasitism, so like a dog and a tick. similar to predator prey, but like the difference is like a tick, like difference in parasitism versus like predator and a prey is that in parasitism the tick can't survive without the its host. So the parasite has to have a host. So the tick, if it can't find a dog to infect or some other organism that it can like affect, it's going to eventually die off. Whereas like predator prey, both could theoretically find other things in the ecosystem for them to eat. Okay. Moving on. So here's Simpson's Diversity Index, and you look at this and you're like, oh my gosh, like this is a lot, and it's really not. Now this formula looks a little bit different than what you see on the on your AP exam formula sheet. It's not a big deal. It's gonna, the math comes out the same way, but the idea of it is to try and calculate the biodiversity of an ecosystem. Because the more diversity in the ecosystem, we've talked about before, more diversity, that is better because you're going to increase the chances that you're going to have an organism with an adaptation that allows it to survive. So capital N here is referring to the total number of organisms, and this is what capital N versus lowercase n is detailed on your formula sheet. You don't actually have to memorize that, fortunately. Lowercase n is the organism of a particular species. So let me just show you an example for it to make sense. Let's say I'm trying to calculate the Simpson's Diversity Index of a meadow meadows, the flowers in a meadow. So here are your 6 different species and the number for each species. So then what you would do is to calculate big N, the total number of organisms, you would just add up the number of each individual species. So that's how they got 142. Add those up individually. Now, how you would find, what you do need to understand is like this E-looking thing, that's a summation symbol. We talked about that with like the chi-square calculations. So what you do is, looking down here, you have to sum up, so you have 6 different species here, so you have 6 different calculations of n times n minus 1, and you add each one of those up together. So that's what this column right here is showing you. So that if you have a lowercase n 72 for this kind of grass, you would then do 72 times, here, let's do one of them. So it would look like 72 times 72 minus 1. And then you're going to add that to do the next one you do for the field scabious. You would do 23 times 23 minus 1. Add that up, do that same calculation for all of these species, and you add those up. That's how they got 6,246. Okay, so that's the bottom part of the equation. And then the top part is, again, just doing 142 times, then you do n minus 1, capital N minus 1. Anyways, as I said, I think you get the idea. On the AP exam, they would basically give you data like this, and you calculate it. Now, understand what you do with that number. Understand that the higher the number, the better, right? The higher the number, that indicates that you have more species diversity. Okay. And that's what this is trying to say here, right? So if you have a low diversity index, that's bad. What that suggests is, thinking back to like abiotic conditions, that suggests that the abiotic conditions are very, very harsh. So maybe temperature is really, really harsh. You have to be an organism that has very, very specific adaptations so that you can tolerate the stress of the environment and be able to survive. Whereas if you see a high diversity index in the ecosystem, that's a sign of a very well-functioning ecosystem. There's a lot of balance there. There isn't one species kind of boss dogging the whole ecosystem. That typically means favorable abiotic conditions. Usually, like the temperature, or excuse me, your climate versus weather. What's the difference between the two? I don't know if they'd ask you that, but I think it's worth it to you. Yeah.
I think climate is more.
Yes, yeah. You check the weather for one day. Climate is the average of the weather over, I don't know what the cutoff is, but let's say 10 years or something, like a decade or whatever. Anyways, there's favorable climate, water availability, space, things like that for organisms to thrive. All right, invasive species. I feel like that's kind of a fairly well-known concept. So it's some sort of species that basically invades. They're not native to that population, but they come in, and then because, and actually it's not said here, it's actually really important. what would make something an invasive species? Why is you bringing in a certain kind of weed or some random plant? Or when I went to Hawaii, they were really serious. We get to declare like any organism you bring there. Why is it so? Why does something become an invasive species? Why is that so like? Why does like a new species to an area take over? That isn't obvious that would happen. Like when you walk into a new place, everybody doesn't just start like saying like, oh my gosh, that person's taken over. John Tony?
It's because there's no natural
Right.
predators.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah, no natural predators. So that needs to be added on this. No natural predators. Or at least like they're much less likely to have a predator than an organism that like is native to that area. So that's the key thing that they didn't really that's kind of lacking from this slide is the lack of natural predators is what causes that species to kind of take over and makes it so deadly. Here's another example of like Dutch elm disease. There isn't any one example the AP exam is going to care about, but just make sure you're aware of that concept. And again, understanding the idea of no natural predators. I think it's probably, if they're going to ask you about that in the AP exam, it's probably the biggest thing they focus on. Okay, kind of hitting some like your vocab when it comes to ecology stuff. Producer / autotroph. They make their own food. So think of like the produce section of the grocery store. It's a lot of your like fruits and vegetables. They come from plants. Plants can automatically make their food through photosynthesis. Consumer, they consume other organisms to get their food. We also call those heterotroph. So hetero means other. So like they eat other things. Troph is referring to eating, like consuming things. Then you have a decomposer. That's going to be the thing that's going to recycle food in the environment. So it's like your fungi. Even bacteria are considered decomposers too. All right, within consumers, there is a first order, second order, and then depending on the size of getting into a food chain, depending on the size of it, there could be even third or perhaps even fourth order ones. So producers are always your plants, and that's because plants can make their own food, right? They can use the energy from sunlight to make their own food. Remember the arrows go this way? Like, I don't know if you need to hear that. Like sometimes, like when I teach the 7th graders, they would like do the arrows that way, and so I would tell them the arrow is pointing to the belly, as in like the arrow goes to the belly because like that food goes in the belly of the mouse. So perhaps they would show you one with like janky arrows on the AP exam, but anyways, primary consumer are also going to be your herbivores. They only eat plants. Secondary consumers, they eat the primary consumers. Now, technically, it can be a little bit more complicated. There can be some secondary consumers that could eat producers as well. Just understand it can be a little more complex than that. And second order or secondary, just know it's just kind of a different way that you could say it. So tertiary isn't going to eat the secondary and so on. And then all of them are pointing to the decomposers because decomposers break down all of those things. Okay, and they then recycle those nutrients. That's why you have an arrow peeling off and going back to the producers. Because appreciate this, right? If you don't have fertile soil that comes from the decomposers recycling nutrients, you're not going to have very many plants. And that's an important thing of getting into agriculture and stuff, is making sure that you maintain especially that topsoil layer, that the soil is fertile enough for you to keep that flow of producers constant. Okay, then you have a food web. So a food web is made of multiple food chains. Food chain is just showing one sequence of feeding relationships. The food web is going to show all of the complexities. It'll get into, if you're the fox and you can eat multiple things, there might be multiple arrows. Or this rhinoceros here, right? The rhinoceros can eat 2 different kinds of producers. So the food web is going to be more comprehensive with what's going on in the ecosystem. Here's showing you an aquatic ecosystem. So now a key thing to understand with aquatic ecosystems is the plankton typically are going to make up the very foundation of that. Especially the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton can phyto for They can do photosynthesis, so that's what makes them basically the producers of an aquatic ecosystem. Zooplankton will eat the phytoplankton, and then, so on and so on from there. All right, energy pyramids. So, pyramids, they start off stronger at the base and they get narrower towards the top. So producers go on the bottom and then it gets narrower as you go up. Now, the reason why it gets narrower as you go up is because each time there's a move from like the producer to like from one level to another level, from one trophic level, they call it. So a producer would be one trophic level, primary consumers another trophic level. You lose energy. Why would you lose energy as you go from one level to the next?
It's taken up by like other processes.
Other processes? You're kind of around the idea, but when we're thinking of thermodynamics, right? Like, you should be able to talk about this in a little more detail than that. Why are you losing energy? Why do light bulbs get hot? And really energy efficient light bulbs don't get as hot. And how does that relate to this? Ralph, go ahead.
I think isn't this related to the second law of thermodynamics, where as you progress further into the human energy is released?
Yeah, every time you convert energy from one form to another, energy is lost as heat. So that's why when the grasshoppers eat the grass, the amount of calories. So I'll jump to this slide. If you were to measure the amount of calories, like how many people you could feed with like the producers compared to how many people you could feed if we just ate grasshoppers, there's much less. In fact, and this is important for you to understand, only 10% moves on, which means 90%. So 90-10 rule. Make sure you know that only 10% is passed on. This is actually, like the biggest argument for us all being vegetarians is this right here. That just the actual reality that if you took an acre of land and you grew some sort of crop on it, versus if you use that same acre of land and you raise cattle on it, you will get more calories. You can feed more people with that same acre of land if you grow plants versus animals. Now, I wish that wasn't true because I really like meat, but that is just scientifically, that is just actually how it works, though. So, anyways, if you ever in a, vegetarian or, I always mix them up, vegetarian, vegan. Anyways, all right, doesn't matter. Moving on to secession. So, getting to the ending of this. Secession is basically looking at how do ecosystems basically change over time, especially looking at like the plant community. So what happens in secession is there's a gradual replacement of those species over time. So, and it'll make a little more sense when I show you a picture. Primary secession is looking at an area that did not have life before. So it's the establishment of life in an area that did not have life before. So perhaps it's like thinking of like way back in the history of Earth when you like get some of the plate tectonic things and you get the arising of a new island. How could that new island that just arose, how could it eventually turn into like Hawaii with all this life and stuff? I'll show you a picture of how that works. Secondary secession, so think of secondary, it's like later on in time. Secondary secession is like if there's like a wildfire that happens. Like you have an area that already has life, right? So it's just the replacement of a population with with like that the original life got disrupted by a natural disaster. Or just something that humans did. What's the replacement of life look like? So let me just run through the examples, help it make sense. So primary secession, again, no life before. It's a bare rock. You will first get something called a pioneer species. So think of the pioneers, right? They kind of are the ones that establish certain areas. So the pioneer species, moss is the main example of a pioneer species. I would just make note of that. Like, understand moss are going to come first. And especially understanding, like, the nice climbing trees and stuff, those come latest in the process. Understanding kind of generally that kind of trend. Because what you need is you need the moss. You need to get your very basic plants that can grow without very many resources. Like, they don't need a ton of soil for them to grow. Moss is like that. And then their decomposition, so understand how you create the soil to then get the bigger plants, is through the decomposition of those pioneer species. So as they decompose, you can then get the grasses growing. Grasses will die, and you get better and better soil until you can get the growth of like bigger and bigger species. Another thing is to get like the bigger and bigger trees, you just need time, right? It takes time for big things to grow, you know, in addition to having like that really deep soil layer. Here's kind of just another picture showing it to you. So again, the pioneer species, you kind of get into, they skip the moss phase, but technically you go bare field, moss, you get the grasses. Then the intermediate stage where you get a lot of your pine forest trees growing. And then, you know, again, the hardwood, the nice like climbing trees, that's going to be the final, they call it the climax community, so it's the very ending. The climax community is where you get like, you know, again, the nice climbing trees after you've had the time and the nice deep soil for them to grow in. So here's showing them side by side. So primary succession, kind of already talked about it, but really want to focus on secondary succession here. Secondary succession, you already have life, right? You already have a climax community. So perhaps, and why it's not kind of nice seeing them side by side, perhaps you had a barren landscape and you get the climax community that develops. And then again, say there's a wildfire, doesn't matter who started it, wildfire happens, you then get, because what happens in a wildfire is all of those nutrients there don't just disappear, they'll go back down to the soil. That'll actually give a lot of nutrients in the soil for you to get the reemergence of life. But understand this, you can, in secondary succession, this is like the key difference between the two, or one of the key differences, you can jump straight to the intermediate community. In other words, getting back to the climax community happens faster in secondary succession than it does in primary succession. Why? Why are you able to get back to the climax community faster in secondary succession than in primary succession? That's a really important thing to understand.
There are like seeds from the immediate cluster.
Good, yeah, you have good. Yeah, you got some seeds that maybe survived. And then also like the richness of the soil, right? When all these things die, their nutrients will get put back in that soil. Whereas when you start with just a barren landscape, it takes time for you to develop that soil so you can get the bigger plants growing. Okay. How long is this? I forgot even how long I made this. I think we're almost at the end. All right, yeah, we're almost there. Hang in there. I know we're stretching. So talking about a food chain, what determines like the length of a food chain? We've kind of already talked about this. Just the idea of like, again, each time you go from one level to the next, to the next, to the next, you're losing 90% of that energy as heat. So that's going to limit the size of it. If you have a food chain that's really, really long, that's typically going to be a little less stable just because there's just a lot going on in it. If you end up removing one of those links, it's like a Jenga tower. If it gets too big, maybe it's not like a Jenga tower. It's like building a house of cards, perhaps. The bigger it gets, just the more unstable it tends to get with just different factors that can knock something out. And then everything else that depends on it goes out, right? You have a super long food chain and oops, this falls, then everything above that will end up falling. All right, last thing, I want to talk about dominant and keystone species. So the dominant species, that would be the thing that has the highest biomass, meaning if you were to like collect up all of the organisms and measure the amount of calories that there are there, the dominant species would be the most abundant, would be the one that has the highest number there. So there's the most amount of them. Keystone species, that's going to be the species that's like at the keystone. It's like the most important species in the community. Meaning, like for example, sea otter, grizzly bear, and prairie dogs, those are all keystone species. If you lose a sea otter, well, sea otters, they eat the sea otters eat sea urchins. So if you lose sea otters, well, then you're going to increase sea urchins. Well, if you increase sea urchins are going to eat all the kelp forests. Kelp forests are your producers, so then boom, the whole ecosystem can collapse. So if you're an ecologist studying ecosystems, you really want to protect the keystone species the most. That's the most important species to protect, and that's really the big thing to get from here. Okay. All right. Any questions? Okay. So you got a mastering bio on on this stuff, and then there you go.